Okay, this is a download page for PopMesh where you will also find installation instructions. The link to this page is in the video description. Now, before we go into the presentation, I would like to thank the people who requested the video. As I was recording it, I became aware of some changes in Blender's implementation of the NLA strip class between versions 2.93 and 3.3 LTS. To be more precise, I'm talking about the new start and frame UI properties and how they interact with the scale and repeat properties. Consequently, I decided to modify those parts in the code that deal with the NLA strip editing to make sure that the end result is the same in both LTS versions of Blender. And while I was at it, I also added another feature which I felt was missing from the original upload. So once again, big shout out to the friends over at blenderartist.org. Now, if you have installed PopMesh already, I encourage you to replace it with a new version which is available here. Just remove the old one from Blender first. When you enable PopMesh in Blender Preferences, it will show up on the sidebar. Click on the MPop tab to see it. There are 11 sub-panels in total, 10 editors and the setup section at the top. All the sub-panels can be expanded, collapsed and reordered in typical Blender fashion. Notice that because we don't have a mesh object yet, all the editors are disabled. Let us focus on the setup section for now. There are 3 ways to load a mesh: using the current settings, the default settings, or loading settings you have previously saved to file. Since this is the first time we launch the add-on, I would go with default option. And there you have it. Now we have a mesh and the editor subpanels are enabled. You can of course rename the new object and PopMesh will update. Once again, use the 4 action buttons at the top to load a mesh or load and save settings. The remaining buttons are actually checkboxes and mostly self-explanatory. There are 3 shortcuts to the smooth normals, smooth shading and wireframe display options that we often use with mesh objects, and 1 for confirmation pop-up warnings. The remove checkbox will allow you to load settings to the same mesh object if checked, or to a new one if unchecked. If you want to keep the changes you have made to the current working mesh and start working with a new one, make sure Remove is unchecked. Okay, at this stage we can make a note of the first in our list of important points. PopMesh is available in object mode. If you go to edit mode, the add-on will not be available. Furthermore, any changes to the mesh will be overridden when you return to object mode and use PopMesh again. Another important point is that in Blender we can work on a mesh data block independent of the object. All the editor panels in PopMesh modify the object's mesh, with one exception, namely the object rotation editor. I have added this editor for convenience in case you want to make a quick animation at the object level. Notice that when we create a new mesh, the object's rotation mode is quaternion. If you prefer to do your object rotations in another mode, simply select it in the object properties. When you do that, the rotation editor panel is disabled. These 2 editors define the mesh shape. They're very similar in layout, but their roles are quite different. To begin with, the profile is a 2D shape on the XY plane, whereas the path can be any shape in 3D. The default mesh here has a path of straight line and a profile of rectangle. There are some preset path and profile shapes, and you can also use your own custom shapes. Note that only mesh objects are allowed for custom shapes. To enter an editor, you just click the Edit button. Each path or profile shape will have a set of options, and some of these options are the same for all shapes. In the case of open-end paths, like a straight line for example, you may use the end caps option. All these options, and in fact all the user interface elements, show description tips when you hover your pointer over them. You may increase the segments of preset paths and profiles in the main interface. The maximum value is 300. However, it is preferable to select only a small number of segments to define your shape and then add a subsurface modifier to the object. I only say it is preferable because this is the way that I work, but of course, you can do whatever you like. Personally, I will have 3 modifiers, subsurf, bevel and solidify, and enable or disable them as I work with a model. Let us now look at how you could use a custom shape. Here I have already created a couple of shapes and I will use one of them as my path. So, from the type drop-down list, I select custom, and in the object field I select the desired mesh object. Alternatively, you could drag and drop a mesh object in this field. The remaining editors act as modifiers of the mesh that you have defined. Most of these editors have 2 main sections. The item section, where you can change the start index for the effect, the number of items the effect is applied to, the direction of the effect, number of steps or the number of times the effect is repeated, the alternate step factor modifier, and the number of items between each repeat. Now the second section is the interpolation, with settings to enable or disable the interpolate option. Select the interpolation type from linear, in, out or in and out. Set the fall-off exponent from 0.5 to 5. Mirror the fall-off effect and exclude the last increment. Of course, going over all the parameters in every editor, including the animation mode, would be a long process with questionable benefits. Instead, for the remainder of this video, I will use some examples to highlight a few of the features. Okay, so to recap, here is a list of the main points about using PopMesh in Blender. I hope this presentation was useful, and please feel free to post a comment if you have questions. Thank you for watching.